script. Good morning. I'm Fred Heldenfels and have the honor of chairing the Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation in Texas Higher Education. And as always, it's a pleasure to welcome the council members. This is your 8th meeting. Probably doesn't seem like it. Time flies when you're having fun. I want to appreciate you again for your commitment to Texas and the leadership that you're lending to this council to help our state achieve outstanding higher education. Just as a reminder to not only ourselves but the public, this council has 2 charges. First, identifying metrics for Texas international competitiveness by 2030, and secondly, developing a culture in Texas higher education that is dedicated to the continuous improvement of educational outcomes and all components necessary for Texas to be internationally competitive. The second charge includes reviewing and recommending processes that increase efficiency and effectiveness across all higher education activities and identifying best practices in all areas of campus operations that have demonstrated success. As you may recall from our meeting in April, council members had requested a session at the July meeting regarding higher education accountability systems and indicators of key performance in Texas community college districts. However, due to some unfinished work that community colleges are doing in this very area, we plan to have that session at our council's October meeting, and it'll be on that agenda instead. So we will be getting to that. For our meeting today, and to continue the process of identifying, reviewing, and recommending best practices, each of you has a packet of hard copy materials, and in the packet are our agenda for today, the minutes of our last meeting, of course, the biographies of those who will be presenting today, certain presentations and handouts in order of their appearance, at least if they got stuffed in there correctly, including UT's recent report examining the ways in which UT Austin might increase its operational efficiency and productivity. Later today, Kevin Hegarty, UT's VP and CFO, will be giving us an overview of this report that was produced by a commission appointed by President Bill Powers. Also included in the packet is the text of a news article that was in a recent edition a couple days ago of the Bryan College Station Eagle. It talks about the announcement by Texas A&M System Chancellor John Sharp in leading that system through a self-evaluation aimed at examining efficiencies and quality of service. So the subjects we're dealing with are ever front and center in the minds of the not only our institutions but the public and the press as well. Finally, in your packet are the names of the members of each of our small discussion groups for today's small group get-togethers after lunch. After considering the minutes from our April meeting, we will, just to overview the agenda, hear from Dom Chavez, our Senior Director of External Relations at the Coordinating Board, who's going to give us an update on the 83rd legislative session. In April, we got an update of what we thought would happen. Now we'll know what really happened. And one bill in particular that has some bearing on this council as well. Afterwards, we'll hear from Mr. Hegarty, who will give us the overview of the report I mentioned, Smarter Systems for a Greater UT. After Mr. Hegarty's presentation and our discussion, we'll move to the Closing the Gaps Planning Room, or Situation Room, that is sort of the fulfillment of a vision and a purpose that Chairman Dan Branch and I have been discussing over the last 2 years, where we have real-time, on-the-screen, drill-downable data on how Texas is doing in closing the gaps. Technology beyond my ability to operate it, but fortunately we have folks here that can make it hum. So you'll get a demonstration of that by Susan Brown and our Director of Planning, Julie Eklund. I think you will be favorably impressed, and we will also, by doing that, give you an update of where we are on closing the gaps by 2015. Then we will remain in that room to consider the 4 potential goals for moving beyond closing the gaps, and in particular, the potential timeline for moving forward with launching that next plan. Mary, this is a really long script. The 3 questions that we'll be entertaining in small groups are, What would your group add to the potential timeline? What would your group delete from the potential timeline? And what additional recommendations, thirdly, does your group have regarding the proposed schedule to develop consensus and secure institutional feedback on the potential goals and measurable targets associated with each of our 4 major goals?
Can I say one?
Yeah, if I'm almost done and almost to the motion for the minutes, so hang on just a second, Charles. Of course, we'll summarize that as we always do. Before we get started today, I do need to alert you to at least one adjustment that needs to be made to the potential timeline. Due to agency priorities and staff work related to bills passed in the 83rd Legislature, the Coordinating Board won't be ready till October, our October meeting, to consider the Council's final recommendations to the Coordinating Board regarding the timeline. So we do have some additional time to make our final recommendations. And then, unfortunately, I also wanted to let you know that one of our esteemed members, Pam Williford, has decided to resign her position due to conflicts. I think everything from a family wedding to other commitments have led to her decision. So we appreciate Pam's service. Obviously, she'll be difficult to replace given her history and background with the Coordinating Board and her experience, but we really appreciate that she participated as part of this council and contributed to it over our first 7 meetings. All right. So now we can get started. Charles, if you would like to say something before I ask for a motion for the minutes.
It's something that might be helpful for everybody to see. I got up too early this morning and forgot to bring it. But yesterday there was online a report that just came out where they had surveyed all of the CFOs in colleges in the country, asking them what they think about the future of their institutions, the financial institutions, and the viability of those institutions. The numbers and the comments were stunning, and I know that somebody out there can pull that off. I take all of this stuff. I don't think it was a Higher Education Chronicle, but it was one of those that it came out. In other words, it went out everywhere yesterday, and should be readily available. But it would be very interesting for everybody to see because it reemphasizes what this council's been talking about for 2 years. I mean, it gives you a real hard number. As I remember, only about 27%, well, a significant number of people do not believe, people that are CFOs, that the model that's currently in place is sustainable. And a high percentage of them are worried about how they're going to finance higher education going forward. No one expects there to be a great increase in funding, and so how do you manage that model? And it's some of those conversations we've had in here, but it really is instructive to see that national survey. So that's my comment.
So bottom line is you want somebody to Google it so they can
they're already working on it,
and then share it with this council. And
yes,
I think that's
right.
a good idea.
Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that. All right. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes from our April meeting? I have a motion from Jody and a second from at least a couple folks. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. All right. Now that we've taken care of that order of business, our program director, Melinda Valdez Ellis, will now give us a brief summary to refresh us on really the outcomes, the takeaways from our April 24th meeting. Melinda?
Thank you. Good morning, council members. Okay, again, our last meeting on April 24th, the meeting focus was best practices in performance management. And 2 questions were asked of the council members. How can the council play a role in developing a culture in Texas higher education that is dedicated to the continuous improvement of educational outcomes? And there was a general consensus that the council should continue to play a role of an advisory group to the Coordinating Board. And 2 of the 3 groups agreed that responsibly center management should be promoted and every institution should be encouraged to consider it. The groups also felt that this council would be a good avenue to keep this idea ongoing. And all 3 groups felt the council should recognize efficiency among institutions and be able to help spread that practice to other institutions in the state. Second question asked how the council could play a role in identifying best practices in campus operations and whether or not they should identify these best practices, and if so, how. All three groups agreed that, again, the council should continue to act as a forum to relay this important information to and from the Corning Board staff, faculty, and staff of institutions. The groups felt the council should act as a catalyst in promoting public awareness of the key practices performed at these different institutions. And during the small group discussions, all three groups suggested holding an annual conference for institutional representatives to relay ideas of innovation and these performance measurements that were discussed at the April 24th meeting. There you go, short and sweet.
Thank you, Melinda. Any questions or observations regarding our April 24th meeting before we dive into the rest of our agenda? Then next, we will turn it over to Dom Chavez, who I think most of you all know and are familiar with, to give us an update on the key higher education legislation that passed during the 83rd session and was signed into law by Governor Perry. Dom, take it away.
Yep. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members. I'm going to go through a brief presentation. I believe you should have copies of this in your packets. And again, some of this will be familiar because I think the last time we talked, we were working our way through some of these issues, but certainly now we have the final answer on both in terms of how the budget turned out and how some of the policy initiatives are working their way through their session turned out. So that's what I'll be going through briefly here with this presentation. So just some high-level summary and statistics for how the Texas legislature played out. As you know, we concluded on May 27th, at least the regular session. We're now in our second special session. But overall, there were about 5,900 bills that were introduced, and of those, about 1,400 were passed by both chambers and sent to the governor. You can see there were some bills that were vetoed and budget items that the governor decided to line item veto. In terms of higher education, the coordinating board was tracking about, 657 bills related to educational funding and policies. Of those, 155 were signed into law by the governor. And you can see there were some key vetoes related to special item funding for some of our universities, some money that was being allocated to the coordinating board for the water aquifer research, and I think that was more a function of the governor believing that wasn't the appropriate place to put the money. And Senate Bill 15 relating to the authority of governing boards was also vetoed by the governor. In terms of the funding situation, as you all know, when we left last session, we had seen pretty significant reductions overall in funding for higher education as well as state government overall. Given the fact that the economy had turned and we were much better positioned coming into this session, I think generally we're pleased with the increases that we saw, although some would argue we didn't get all the way back to where we were when we saw the reductions from last session. But you can see here the picture broken down by sector. Higher education, in terms of general revenue and general revenue dedicated funding, experienced about a 4.4% increase over last biennium, and overall state government increased by 8.1%. In terms of specific programs and things important to higher education, as you know, for the coordinating board, student financial aid was one of the highest priorities as we entered the session. And so we were pleased that not only was money restored that was reduced last session, but we also saw some new investment. So, for example, the Texas Grant Program experienced about a 25% increase in funding over last biennium. Last biennium, we saw about a 10% reduction. So not only were we able to recoup some of those dollars, but we got new monies inserted in there, which was a positive. Not only is this the largest percentage increase, I also think it's the largest dollar-for-dollar increase biennium over biennium since the program started. So positive development there. It's also important to recognize that that includes a $30 million donation from the Texas Guaranteed Loan Corporation, which has been a good partner for the state and a good friend of the coordinating board in helping support some of these important programs. And so I want to make sure I mention them in this presentation. TEOG, which is the program for our two-year public colleges, you saw also experience a 20% increase. And you can see some of the other important programs there. I do want to point out the Teach for Texas program, a 343% increase, sure looks great, but it's important to realize that that's more a reflection of how that program was eviscerated last session. To put this in context, you go back to biennium, and we funded that program at about $11.5 million over 2 years. And it was reduced more than 90% last session. So that's, looks a little better than it perhaps is. We're still far behind where we were. And as you know, producing teachers more teachers, certified teachers that can teach to the rigors of our college and career readiness standards is certainly one of our sub-goals of closing the gaps and a priority for the coordinating board. So more money, certainly right direction, but we have a long way to go on some of these programs. In terms of other funding priorities, obviously graduate medical education and nursing are important programs that the coordinating board and our institutions advocated for during the session, and we were pleased that more monies were being put into these programs, particularly graduate medical education, knowing that we have a shortage of slots in this state for residencies beyond the schoolhouse, and so we're thankful that not only was there more dollars, but we also have some new programs that were created, and we're going to be working with our health-related institutions to stand those programs up to help expand our slots. In terms of other programs, obviously we saw funding increases for research. Two things I want to point out here are the Hazelwood exemptions. As you know, one of the challenges that we've had, that our universities and public community colleges have had in the last few years, has been the significant, almost exponential increase in the exemptions for our veterans, in terms of not only the veterans but also their dependents, the tuition and fee waivers that go along with that. Those foregone tuition and fees that have been placed on the institutions has increased significantly, and so going into this session there was a lot of talk about, can the state help offset some of those costs? So this is the first time, I believe, since the program's been around that the state has actually put some money towards this program. $30 million does not cover the full exposure that the institutions feel related to this program, but it is certainly some dollars, and it certainly is a recognition by the legislature that those costs are real and that there's a commitment from the state to try to look at that and do more. It's also important to recognize that there is a rider that was passed in the budget that's directed the Legislative Budget Board to consult with the coordinating board, who we will also consult with the institutions, and I suspect the Texas Veterans Commission, to look at this going forward in terms of how can we sustain what I think most everybody agrees is a very positive program, but that there's real costs associated with it. So that's something we'll have more conversation about. Yes, sir.
What did the colleges estimate their loss was, or the cost of the providing that service?
I believe, and I'm looking over my shoulder at Dan Weaver, I think it was $150 million.
That was over $100 million.
Yep.
So they gave you $30 million out of $150.
Correct. And understand that 150, that's increased significantly, and that curve, I don't think there's any, there's no expectation that curve is going to bend downward anytime soon. That was a one-time. There's no longer-term commitment beyond this budget, other than that study that's LBB is directed to look at. Correct. That is correct. That was just the Hazelwood exposure.
The best thing that he said is there's a study to go forward. I think the legislature really hadn't comprehended the cost to that when it was put in. I think Vanderbilt carried the bill, the cost of that, and I knew it was increasing. I knew the colleges were really beginning to hurt.
And the significant, the greatest growth in that exposure has occurred amongst the dependents, because you recall 2 sessions ago the program was expanded, the legacy portion was expanded to allow veterans who do not use their benefit of 150 hours to pass that along to their children. And so that's been a significant growth in the program as well. So more conversation to come on that proposal. And then the other thing here, as I mentioned, producing teachers that can teach to the high standards of college and career readiness standards. There's a new program, the Texas Teacher Residency Program, received $1 million that we'll be working with the legislative leaders and our institutions to create and stand up so we can strengthen the pipeline of teachers for our public education system. I'll now just briefly walk you through the different sectors in terms of formula funding. First, health-related institutions, as you can see here, a pretty healthy increase. You'll specifically notice the graduate medical education funding that flows through the formulas was about a 16.7% increase over last biennium, which is a positive. Our general academic or universities, again, about an 8% increase in funding over last biennium. Our technical and state colleges, a modest 3% increase over last biennium. And finally, our community colleges, about a 2.1% increase. One thing I want to point out here that was an important change in the way we fund our community colleges, and I suspect will carry forward into future bienniums. You'll notice in the 14-15 appropriated dollars, there's $50 million in base funding. This was a request of the community college sector that each college should be given some sort of floor funding for operations of $1 million each for the biennium, so that to support basic operations and then have formulas flow on top of that. That was a very important change that was made in funding for community colleges this session, and so I wanted to at least point that out, and I suspect going forward that will continue, or at least will be advocated for on a regular basis. Now, in terms of policy, as we make the shift away from the budget, one of the major policy initiatives that was adopted that was certainly a priority of the coordinating board was to move our funding for institutions to an outcomes-based funding model where we not only fund based on enrollments but also on how well our institution produce outcomes at our public, community, technical, and universities. So what we have here was, of the three sectors that we were looking at outcomes-based funding, the legislature decided to move towards an outcomes-based system for two of those sectors. And the first one is indicated here on this slide for our public community colleges. And this was, again, outlined in Senate Bill 1. This may look familiar to you. I know we've talked about this before, but this is the model that will be executed this session or for the next 2 years at our public community colleges. 90% of the funding will continue to be based on contact hours, but 10% of the funding will now be funded based on outcomes in these various categories that are commensurate with the role and mission of our community colleges. For example, developmental education and how well students complete that track if they require it, how well students complete their gateway courses in key subject areas, attaining credit, again, towards either transfer and degree, and also credentials awarded and transfer to public universities or transfer to a university overall. As you can see here, we also, in collaborating with the community colleges, provide additional credit for those credentials awarded in STEM and critical fields. Now, it's important to point out here that one of the reasons this measure was successful this session was because the community colleges really partnered with the coordinating board to make the case that this is the right direction to move towards for funding our public community colleges. I will also point out that there is a rider directing the coordinating board and community colleges to work collaboratively together during this interim to further refine this proposal, to talk about how do we refine it going forward. Are there other metrics or measures we should look at? For example, you'll see there at the bottom, there was some conversation about looking at adult basic education outcomes and perhaps English as a second language. That those may be important outcomes we may want to look at in future model, and also how do we specifically allocate these outcome dollars and how are they dispersed around the state to institutions based on these outcomes. So that's an important point that I want to make here, is that this became a reality because the community colleges were great partners with the coordinating board and the business community talking about this as a way forward for higher education, at least in that sector.
Let's stop right there for a minute.
Yep.
I think that this is critical in terms of your outcome funding that is done appropriately and correctly, because this might very well be the model, Chancellor, for how we look at four-year institutions on outcome funding in the next session. I know that the business community was very interested in moving forward with outcome funding, so the work that's done here and the results that you ascertain will be examined, I'm sure, to look at four-year institutions and how we move forward.
Juddy, the other thing I really want to underscore, Dom alluded to this, but the reason that outcomes-based funding was adopted for community colleges and was adopted for our state technical colleges is because of the leadership of the community colleges and the technical colleges. They it wasn't just because they collaborated, quote unquote, with the coordinating board. It was because they reached out and aggressively pursued it with the legislature themselves. And so I've had the chance to publicly commend TAC and other organizations, as well as the innovation of the Texas State Technical Colleges. And so it's really it's a credit to their institutional as well as state organizational leadership.
Jody, are you aware that there was a bill requesting the same type of funding?
Yes, sir.
You know,
Yes, sir. I am.
That was really,
because it didn't have the same level of support.
Yes, sir.
you know, the overview, and I don't know whether Dom has this in his summation, but the coordinating board had about, depending on how you count the parts and pieces, about 30 significant policy initiatives or recommendations. And of those, I think 19 passed into law.
That's about right.
Approximately, so almost 2/3 batting average. And really, the only major disappointment was just what you raised: adoption of outcomes-based funding for our four-year universities. Otherwise, as Dom is kind of going through the details, it was really a very successful policy session
Well,
and funding session.
One of the things that we need to look at moving forward, though, Fred, and this is not something the council can do, but I mean, we will have to look at in terms of the coordinating board as we get into the next legislative session from a governance standpoint at the local level. Because of the 2-year funding lag, we invest at the local level, or we sustain the operation for 2 years, and we do that with the expectation that there'll be a reimbursement from the state legislature. And so if you look at the 10% set aside, we're basically re-earning money we've already earned. And I'm just saying that from a board member's perspective. And we need to look at that model to see how best or how we can readjust that funding so that at the local level we can sustain our budgets. And again, as you can see, we're not losing the steam, but we're having to be more efficient because we're working with less. You know, and so right now we're passing our budgets, and I can tell you from our standpoint at Alamo, I think the state contribution is now down to around 21% of our budget, and so we're having to make up more and more
Like our state
through local
universities,
sources. Yeah. And again, it's important to look at in this discussion in terms of the governor's asked for. How can we do a $10,000 degree? Well, you can't do it without community college involvement. And so that needs to be looked at. And then we have all the exemptions that Dominic just pointed out that we're having to absorb. So all that mix needs to be looked at. I mean, this model is a great model. But when you look at it from my standpoint, from where I sit as a trustee, you really have to look at the funding aspect of it.
Well, and if you're not going to dial the revenue side, then you've got to look at and take away some of those mandated costs and give the community colleges, and for that matter the universities, more flexibility in how they deal with those costs. So
yeah, and I think it's
there's a lot of talk about that in the 2011 session.
We need to look at exemptions because, again, we looked at them from our standpoint, and they're in the millions of dollars. And then, again, we look at dual credit processes we have. They're very we, for example, don't charge for dual credit and don't get any revenue stream from them other than the contact hours. And so there's a lot of that to be looked at in order to look at how we're going to proceed forward. If you're looking at a sustainable model throughout the state, you're really going to have to focus on looking at it more comprehensively than just the particular appropriation that the legislature passes.
Yeah, well said. Lee?
That I won't comment on this, but I think that I should, because it's more than just a bill that was filed. It's an issue that is not going away. It's under discussion even this week, as you know, as some state officials continue to discuss college construction issues, and many hope that the two end up being tied together. Let me just say a couple of things from my perspective, speaking only for myself. One is I would note, and by the way, my hat is off to the community college leadership that recognized the importance of this and came together with a package and partnered with the coordinating board. That's the right model. We had a working group sponsored by the coordinating board that met, I believe, in this room. I was not a member of that group, but they reached a consensus around a package with multiple variables, also at 10% of projected funding, and was approved by consensus pretty much, as I recall. I think that proposal was officially endorsed. At 15 and 25%, that consensus evaporated. Now, whether it was directly related to the difference, the evolution from 10 to 15 to 25%, but it is certainly true that in some parts of the state where students have a significantly lower bachelor's level completion rate than in the higher income or higher socioeconomic parts of the state, in those parts of the state that believe they would start behind the curve in this new model, that increased emphasis on outcomes funding eroded the consensus. They thought they would never catch up, that they would never be able to increase graduation rates and the other measures enough to catch up to, say, a 25% reduction in funding. And then the last observation I would make, on things like Hazelwood Impacts and others, there are really, really extraordinarily wide variations among the 38 senior institutions. I don't know if the community colleges have as significant a variation in graduation rates, in funding, in tuition, in participation in state funding. We have institutions that receive a tremendous amount of earnings from large endowments. We have some that receive indirect funding from research, and then we have many that receive almost nothing. So the disparities that have to be addressed in a four-year formula to then somehow equalize the playing field and let everyone feel like they'll have a chance to compete and progress are, as you know, much harder. I do think that there is probably a way out there. It'll be a formula that will continue to be revised and refined and may end up having even more different levels of points for different kinds of institutions. But I do think the issue is there. I do think the community college success is a model, and we'll all keep working on it.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's although the point of this point in the agenda is not to drill down into this, but it is an object lesson in a sense. Two things, that I would respond to. One is that HB 25 proposing 25% for a succeeding biennium really was separate and apart and never even on the radar screen with our recommendation, which was just to allocate 10%, and that was the consensus of the Formula Funding Advisory Committee, on which all systems and 3 of the 4 independents were represented. So I think unintentionally that legislation created doubt and confusion, so to speak, that led to that rider kind of being pushed to the side, which was a shame. There was a lot of work that went into that consensus, and the coordinating board, in the spirit of that work, adopted and recommended exactly what the Formula Funding Advisory Committee recommended. Going forward, though, I would encourage leadership of the state to look at the many, many states who have adopted this and are already ahead of Texas on this, particularly Ohio, where I was struck by the fact that not only are they at 50% outcomes, they are moving towards 100% outcomes-based funding. And they're doing it not through a coordinating agency or legislative mandate necessarily, but they're actually doing it through a council, not unlike this one, but it's a council of the chancellors and presidents of their varied institutions with the different missions and the different cost constructs. I think Chancellor Gee chaired it, but they had a broad spectrum of 12 to 15 chancellors and presidents. And I think one of the things they discovered is there's a way to have outcomes that are in part common and in part custom for the mission of the institution. And I think they also are working in the spirit of the fact that in the current public funding environment, they have more control over the outcomes in a lot of cases than the inputs. And so if the metrics are well defined and thought through and take into account the 38 variables, it's 38 institutions and their different variables, then I think there's a high chance, whether it happens this summer or 2 years from now, that success as well as consensus will be built.
Brent, I want to congratulate you on something in that 3 years ago or more, your leadership really started taking us in this direction. Community colleges really weren't as big a focus with the coordinating board and statewide agenda as they are now, and a lot of it had to do with your leadership, and I appreciate that. But there is a lot of work to be done, and Lee, you're right about community colleges. We're at a beginning point here. If you look at Alamo, we're large, we've got a lot of resources. We can address this agenda without any problem at all. But you look at Clarendon, for example. There's a very big difference between Clarendon and San Antonio in terms of resources and so on. So the base allocation was very important for them. Take Ranger Community College. I mean, they have no ad valorem capability. So this is going to be quite a boon to them, and they can start addressing some of these given the resources that this provides. So there's a lot of work to be done in that. And again, it's all a matter of how sustainable our efforts are. Most of the community colleges, and Brenda will probably agree with me, have already been well underway, given our student success agenda on this road of trying to get more graduation rates up, our sustaining students coming from one semester to another and moving forward. So I think we're going to be fine in Alamo and in Lone Star and also San Jacinto. And but if you look at some of the smaller community colleges, they're going to need some support to meet this agenda.
Well, that base funding concept was
It's a godsend.
Yeah.
It's a godsend.
Dom, I'm going to ask you to do your best to skip through and hit just the highlights. And are you going to address HB 2036?
It's at the end, so give me 2 minutes. I'll get right to it, and then, because I think that's where you want to drill. So
Ready, set, go.
So very quickly here, again, one of the other outcome models that were adopted with strong support from the TSTC system was a return value model, which is a very unique model. I think Tennessee's doing something like this, but this is something that Texas really is in the vanguard of the leading cutting edge in terms of funding our technical colleges based on wages and job placement and those types of outcomes. And so this is being implemented with strong support from the TSTCs over the next 2 years and going forward. Again, 100% of their funding will be based on that. The chairman mentioned the coordinating board's 30-some-odd other recommendations for the session. They kind of fell into three buckets, if you will. One, create a productive higher education system, restructure our financial aid system to serve more students with the funding that we have, and continue to sustain a rigorous public education system. A couple key highlights from that. Again, this was a recommendation to place a credit hour cap on associate degrees. It actually came out of the 2010 cost efficiency report. It's something a way for us to not only create statewide consistency for associate programs at our two-year colleges, but also an attempt to squeeze down the credits to degree. As you can see here from our graduates with associate degrees are still taking far too many credits to earn that degree. And so this is one measure that was passed that will basically cap associate degrees to no more than what's required by accrediting or licensure, which in most cases will be 60 credit hours. In terms of financial aid, the programs were restructured slightly to improve efficiency and efficacy. First, Texas Grants. As you know, Texas Grants currently is available for university and community college or two-year college students. Beginning in fiscal year 15, it will become a university-only program. The reason being is the program has requirements that are probably more aligned with university students than community college students. In order to make that transition work, the legislature has expanded the eligibility pathway for community college students who receive a TEOG while they're at the community college to be eligible for a Texas grant if and when they transfer. And then most importantly, as you can see in that yellow box, to ensure we don't lose any service level for our two-year students, we're going to be transferring about $34 million from Texas grant to TEOG in that second year of the biennium to make this work. And then most importantly, this was a recommendation from the coordinating board. It did not get into statute, but it was a directive, if you will, of the budget that the awards for universities be targeted at about $5,000 for the biennium. Given that $724 million that was appropriated, if the target amounts do achieve that $5,000 level, we expect to serve about 84% of new eligible students over the next 2 years. Be on Time, again, this will become a university-only program as well, beginning in fiscal year 15. Again, it's available to two-year students currently, but the efficacy of the program, which asks you to graduate in 4 years, simply didn't really align with community college students and their ability to meet those requirements. So that changes will happen in fiscal year 15, and again, more flexibility given to universities to make those awards work. You'll be familiar, House Bill 5 was a major piece of public education change in terms of the curriculum requirements, creating different pathways towards a diploma. This certainly, because of our connection in the whole P16 pipeline, this had a significant impact on higher education as well. As you can see here, these are some of the changes. The most important thing that the coordinating board will be working with our partners at the Workforce Commission and the TEA is to make sure that students are advised when they make these decisions about their diploma, as early as 8th and 9th grade, that they're advised about what those choices mean and how that will affect them if they want to make post-secondary education one of their future goals. Here again, just a couple of different bills related to some of the things this council may be interested in. I won't go through those. You can review those separately. Again, graduate medical education, important not only in terms of funding, but a couple new programs that are being created and funds trusted to the coordinating board to work with our institutions to increase GME slots. And New South Texas University, as you know, UT Pan American and UT Brownsville will eventually merge into a single university with a medical school, which many believe will transform the region significantly. Now to get to the point that I think is most important for this council and some pieces of legislation. First, House Bill 1296 is essentially requiring the coordinating board to coordinate with the Texas Workforce Commission and other state agencies to outline what the projected workforce needs are in the future and to make these kind of 5-year projections, but also require that we identify the types and levels of education, training, and skills that are needed to meet those requirements, and essentially make recommendations for programs and other initiatives that can help achieve those at our public and private post-secondary institutions. So that's may sound familiar. That's a lot of the work that this council has been looking at, but also the coordinating board going forward in terms of planning for the next plan beyond closing the gaps. And then finally, House Bill 2036, which was some legislation authored by Chairman Dan Branch. You may ask, why 2036? Apparently that is the bicentennial of the state of Texas, and the chairman is a big history buff, so he thought it was appropriate. It will create a bit of a challenge because most of the talk, both nationally and in the state, is always looking at 2030, whether it's the Lumina Foundation for Education, Jobs for the Future, our work in talking about the next plan. We're always looking kind of 15-year windows. Have to find some way to align those timelines. But basically, this is going to be a high-level commission. In terms of the participants, it will be the chair of the Texas Workforce Commission, the chair of the coordinating board, the commissioner of higher education, the chairs of the Senate and House higher education committees, one chair of a board of regents to be appointed by the governor, one trustee to be appointed by the governor, and the lieutenant governor and speaker of the House both have 2 appointees. So this will be a very a high-level commission, if you will, that's going to be required every 2 years to produce a report looking at things such as, what are the future higher education and workforce needs and how we're going to meet those needs. Basically looking at how are we going to attain a state workforce in which at least 60% of the workers have some sort of post-secondary credential or certain degree of value in the workplace. Increasing the number of national research institutions by at least 3, increasing the college attending population, improving affordability, and ensuring the global competitiveness of the state. So those are kind of the charges of this commission. And now the challenge will be with that commission, the work of this council, the work of the coordinating board going forward on the next plan is making sure that everyone's kind of aligned and moving in the same direction. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, that's the end of the presentation. I think that's where you wanted to leave it.
And when will this commission begin its work?
That's a good question. I would have to check. Well, I can look here real quick to see if it's takes effect immediately. I don't know if I have that here. Doesn't say here. I'll have to check. It did take, because of did gain 2/3. The commissions, or the legislation is now effective. I don't think there's been a formal talk about how this gets stood up yet, or if there's any sort of schedule on how this moves forward, but we can look into that and we'll report back to you.
So, you know, given this commission, I think it's a logical question for us as council to ask ourselves, you know, does our role continue in parallel to this commission? Does this council conclude its work by year end or early next year and turn it over to this commission as input into their efforts? One thing I would encourage is that while I very much appreciate Chairman Branch's sense of history and the significance of our 200th anniversary as a world power, I don't think the goal should be to just take 6 years longer to meet the goals that we've begun to define. I think, you know, I'm reminded that many states, like Indiana, for example, have set goals similar to these to be met by 2025. And even at the federal level, there's been a lot of talk about trying to hit that 60% as a nation by 2020. And we know that while historically southern states have lagged about 10 years behind northern or northeastern and western states or coastal states in higher education attainment, you know, that's a gap we definitely want to close. And so I think it's important for both this body and the commission to be named, to be formed with some public appointees, that they set sort of an aggressive and an innovative way to use the time between 2030 and 2036, but also recognize the importance of hitting the major goal and supporting 4 goals at as early a milestones as can be.
Mr. Chairman, I see this as an incredible opportunity, positive opportunity, because you're going to, for the first time, you're going to have the high-level leadership begin to have discussions like we were having in this council, and they're going to quickly learn that the problem is more complex than you have time to contemplate in 140 days every 2 years. And I think they will take, I would be stunned if they didn't, they will take the work this council has done, and the council continues to do it, because they're going to continue to look for educated, well thought out input, and this council will be able to provide that. And I think that, you know, it's like all of these kinds of commissions, they think they're going in one direction until they get the facts, and then they kind of realign. And this is a group of people that'll be smart and plugged in, and I think it'll help build support for what this council and the coordinating board is trying to do in higher education. I think it could be a very positive. I think it'd be a very positive thing, because my experience in my years of testifying is there was a great disconnect between what the academy knew about these issues and what the elected officials knew. I mean, it was huge, and you've run into that a couple of times probably, and this will help change that. And so I think it's a very positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chairman, the first milestone, and it is actually laid out here in statute, so the first milestone in terms of schedule is that the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker must make their appointments no later than November 1st of this year. So that's kind of the first marker out there in terms of a timeline.
So it's likely that they'll have their initial organizational meeting prior to year end. Once those appointments are made, I would
conceivably, yeah.
Speculate. Okay, thank you for sharing that. And Charles, I agree. I think the good news about this bill is it makes the effort that we've been engaging in sustainable. You know.
I think it's.
All right, Elaine, would you like to come up? Dom, I appreciate the report, and now we will turn to the next item on the agenda. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Hegarty, CPA, and important to us, Vice President and CFO for the University of Texas at Austin. Mr. Hegarty is responsible for accounting and finance, budgeting and forecasting, procure to pay, business contracts, payroll, IT, technical security, and campus real estate, which makes Kevin a very popular man on campus. I will, in the interest of catching up a little bit on our agenda, encourage everyone to review Kevin's impressive bio in your materials, and we'll turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, before he presents, I have to say that he was so helpful to me through Graduate School of Business. So I'm being transparent. Thank you, Kevin, and you were extremely helpful to me. Thank you so much. Now,
thank you, Jody.
no tough questions for me, right?
Was he your tutor? Are you saying he tutored you? Or?
No, sir. We were there at the same time.
Okay.
I looked to work on teams with him.
Well, as we say, Jody and I are brothers from another mother, and we, along with a bottle of Chivas every now and then, got each other through graduate school.
There you go. There you go.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to address the council, Mr. Chairman. My name is Kevin Hegarty. I've been at the University of Texas now for 12 years, and I spent my first 25 years after having left the university in large corporate service, principally in Dallas. And I see Phil there too. Hi, Phil. Phil is a colleague, a longtime colleague also. I wanted to start out with a point that I think is very important, and that is what I'm going to talk today is about a continuing journey that we have at the University of Texas. We have spent a lot of time and a lot of effort over the last decade engaging, identifying, and pursuing activities that will help make the university more efficient in the pursuit of helping make the university as affordable as it possibly can be. And I will leave for the committee afterwards a brief paper that I wrote back in 2012 that outlines a lot of those activities, and I'm leaving them because I hope that perhaps there's some ideas there that you might find. I'm happy to give you more information on any of those ideas and that some of our colleagues might learn from. We do share a lot of information with our colleagues across the state and nationally, because one of the things that we've found, at least I've learned at the University of Texas as a Longhorn, please don't repeat this to our Aggie friends, is that we don't have all the best ideas. We learn from each other, and so it's absolutely amazing that the good work that we do together, particularly when we're not in an athletic venue. So I want to assure the committee that we do correspond. Let me tell you a little bit about the Committee on Business Productivity. This was what happened, and a lot of people say, okay, well, an independent committee of 13 people outside the university, some alums, some not. Why did the president do that? And there are a lot of different reasons, but I think back to my days when I was at the Associates. It was the second largest independent finance company in the world, and the CEO pulled me aside and said, Kevin, you've just joined the company. The greatest contributions that you'll make to this company will happen in the first 2 years that you're at the company. I looked at him kind of funny, and he said, it's because you're not one of us. You don't think like us. You don't act like us. You don't know how we do things, and that's a good thing. We need fresh ideas, fresh thoughts. And that's exactly the principal reason why President Powers approached me about a year and a half ago with the idea of, how about setting up an independent committee, asking people from the business arena with various walks of life and various experiences, to come in and tell us, what they think in three critical areas. We talked about a lot of areas, but came down to three. The first being ideas on how we utilize assets. We think we utilize the assets that we have at the university quite well, but maybe there are other ideas. How we increase technology commercialization, that is, I think, a question that almost every school in America, every researcher in America is asking right now. And then how do we enhance the efficiency and effectiveness of the operations that we have? And there we're principally talking about the back office, the administrative operations. I will tell you that some people have approached us on campus and said, well, times must really be tough if we're doing this. And President Powers has been quick to tell people, look, we ought to manage our expenses. We ought to manage this university the best that we can possibly manage at all times, particularly in the really good times. This is not something that we did because budgets are tight. It's something that we do because we believe that we have the public responsibility. The public expects this of us. And again, that's it's a view into his thoughts, and it's also a view into the belief that ultimately what we're trying to do is, through all of these actions, change the DNA of the university. We want people to begin to think about continuous improvement, not think in terms of, well, we get it to this one spot and then we live with that for the next 125 years. Continuous improvement. And we tell people on campus that's one of the byproducts. Membership of the committee, these are the 13 members. Start off with the chair. I won't roll through all of it, but start off with the chair, Steve Rollator. The reason I want to point out Steve is because we very purposefully ask Mr. Rollator to head this up because we wanted somebody to lead a committee over a wide expanse very fast, and so we wanted somebody that had processed that this is what they did for a living, and it turned out to be a very effective way of doing it. We knew Steve and coming from Accenture would do just that. He didn't have to figure out how do we organize, et cetera. He had a template coming in. Now, what he also figured out, though, was he had 12 very opinionated colleagues that he had to navigate through, and everybody was very active in this committee, but was very effective. One thing I want to say about that, though, is that while we did have 2 people on the committee from Accenture, this is not an Accenture report. Accenture participated in the sense that 2 people on the committee were with Accenture, one former and one current. We did quickly realize, though, that because of the data demands, because of the data needs, and how fast the committee wanted to move, I didn't have enough arms and legs on my staff to deal with that. And so I asked the president if it would be acceptable if I approached Steve Rollator about contributing and part paying for certain talent with people in particular in these particular areas from Accenture. But again, it's not an Accenture report. We had a fairly complex, I'm sorry for the eye chart, but hopefully you can read it in your documents, a fairly complex organizational structure. This committee ultimately reported directly to the president. Me, along with a colleague of mine, Mary Knight, were co-coordinators of the project, and we had a whole host of people across the university involved in this. I will tell you that one gem that Accenture realized very quickly, and it's proven to be a real gem as we make progress towards realizing this, is the fact that 10 years ago we got deeply involved in an idea that I brought to the university from Dell. It was not a new idea, not an original idea, and that's the concept of really high-quality data warehousing. We have the ability at the university to combine data, all kinds of data sets, whether it's financial, non-financial. If you ask me the question, give me the last 10 years of all professors that taught economics by course, by number of credit hours generated, by student, I could do that. We've got very rich data warehousing, and that proved to be a magnificent construct for getting into the grimblies of detail that we needed to accomplish this report. You can see that the committee structured itself along the 3 basic charges, and then they have subcommittees below that. And you can also see some of the names from Accenture that Steve Rollator brought in. Steve Rollator brought in people from Accenture that had been there, done that on all of these topics, and that was particularly valuable when we get to the topic of shared service. I won't go through this, but I just wanted to give you a sense that this was a very structured committee. They had very structured deadlines. As you would expect, an Accenture project, they would blow it out to very detailed tasks and put timelines around it, and the committee stuck to those timelines. It was the wish of the president to have a report in hand. We kicked this off in roughly April and he wanted a report in hand by the end of the year. Now, that to some corporate colleagues would not seem to be light speed, but that in a university setting is light speed. To really have meaty recommendations that you can do something with. And so we were very pleased that, again, Steve Rollator and his colleagues brought this kind of structure to the program. I'll get into the charges now. The asset utilization charge, it was fairly simple. We did not limit the committee as to what they needed to look at, but we just said look at all of the tangible and intangible assets that are at our disposal at the university, and we gave them a list off our balance sheet. I sat at length with the committee and talked about intangible assets that I thought I had, and you folks decide what it is you think you want to look at. And they narrowed that down to a select few. Utilities and energy consumption. For those of you that don't know, we produce our own utilities on the main campus. We've got our own power plant. And we have a cooperative arrangement with Austin Energy where we back them up, they back us up, et cetera, et cetera. But it is a high-cost item on the campus itself. Now, I will say that we do believe that we produce utilities at a much lower price point than Austin Energy for a number of reasons, having to do primarily with the fact that over the last decade we have totally modernized our plants, so we're running on the latest equipment. And also because, and this is also a weak point, we're not diversified. It's very expensive to get into solar energy and wood chip plants and things like that. We are simply a three-stage plant that takes natural gas in as the first product, and then through a series of 3 turbines produces energy from that and some byproducts from that. They also wanted to look at parking.
You also are the most effective buyer of natural gas that I ever met.
Thank you very much. Absolutely.
I got involved in that one time, and I said, you just need to keep this quiet because it's amazing what you.
Well, and one of the things that we did there was absolutely flabbergasting to me. As big a buyer as we are, one of the first questions I asked was, what is our hedging strategy? Hedging strategy, what is that? Well, you know, when the market is so volatile, do you like that? Well, no, we don't like that at all. We need a hedging strategy. We put that in place. We hired some people that knew what they were doing. And we also buy, we have the benefit of buying our gas through the state of Texas. And it's extremely beneficial to higher education, the price point that we get. So you're absolutely right. We should be producing utilities at a lower price point than Austin Energy. Yes, that's correct. Obviously, on the demand side, energy consumption is huge on a campus our size, 20 million square feet, multiple buildings, 50,000 students, 70,000 people coming and going. And that doesn't include the other campuses, such as Pickle, where we actually buy utilities from Austin Energy there. We don't produce up there. They wanted to look at parking. If you've ever been to the University of Texas campus, you will know the #1 issue is parking. You will also know that you can't park anywhere without a permit for more than 3 minutes before the ticket's on your windshield. Parking is a major issue, and they wanted to look at that. And then the final thing was food and housing. We have about 7,500 beds on campus, about the size of our freshman class, although we don't require the freshman class live on campus. We operate those facilities ourselves. On the food side, food is very different. It's a very mixed bag. When I was on campus in the 70s, it was all internal. Now it's almost all external, but it's a big operation on campus. It's the second largest, what we call auxiliary operation on campus, only second to athletics. So those were the assets that they looked at. And what did they find? I'll run through this very quickly, and again, happy to take questions, perhaps at the end or whenever. They looked at the power plant and felt like if we ran the power plant full board, 100% capacity, we would produce an excess amount of utilities, and we could sell those utilities perhaps, there's a big legal question here, a big perhaps, sell it off to the retail markets. And that they felt like over 10 years that would produce about $92 million, $9.2 million a year. And again, I'll come back to this in the end and talk a little bit more about that. They liked the green initiatives that we have on campus. We've gone through and retrofitted for lights. We've gone through and put in motion sensors for all kinds of things, water, et cetera. They identified a few opportunities and felt like you ought to keep banging away at this. There's real money at the savings there, and you can see $11 million. And then capital improvements. They liked the program that we have in terms of retrofitting our campus, primarily in air handling. Many of our buildings are very old. Many of our buildings are still controlled through pneumatic systems versus digital systems. It's very expensive to retrofit, but they encouraged us to keep looking at that cost benefit. It's going to cost you now, but look at the benefit over time. And they felt like there was some substantial savings by increasing the size investment that we make annually in these activities. Now, this is interesting. On the parking side, they felt like we could outsource parking, meaning they got very enamored with the Ohio State transaction, and there have been several others since. And it's the gentleman that was responsible for this, a good friend of his, is a partner with a group called Evercore Partners, also a UT grad, named George Ackert. George had advised Ohio State in their parking transaction. And what Ohio State did was they took all the parking properties, all the assets, and essentially long-term leased it, 60 years or more, to a third party to operate and own. And by the way, they also agreed to 60 years worth of parking rate increases to the tune of 4.5% a year, 4.5% to 5% per year for 60 years, some pretty stout increases. Produces quite a sum of money. Here's the surprising thing. That's the outsourced solution. If you insource, we believe it actually produces more. The key difference is in the state of Texas, and we had discussions at this at length, If I wholesale turnover and ground lease all my parking assets, it puts them in a taxable purview. Today, it's non-taxable. The difference in these two numbers is simply the property tax that the benefit that the university enjoys today because it's off the tax roll, so to speak, in Travis County. But nevertheless, it's something that we ought to look at. And again, I'll come back to that in a few minutes. And then housing and food, they looked at an insourced and an outsourced solution and felt like, one of the things that you might do is look at the A&M approach. And that is A&M took all of their housing and all of their, as I understand it, I've not read through the details of it, all of their food operations, all of their housing, and went to a provider that we actually do business with. They run the AT&T Center, a company called Compass Flick. I think they're dealing with the Compass side, and said, you operate it, you kind of own it, so to speak, over a long-term basis. And, I think that there probably is some, oh, by the way, also they said increase rates in what we charge housing, that we're below market and we need to be closer to market. And again, I'll come back to that point in a second. So all told, on just that one initiative, they were looking at estimates from $240 to $290 million over a 10-year period. Again, no time frame for when you could realize that, because we don't have detailed plans on this. That's what we're working on now. But nevertheless, it's the size money that you really have to pay attention to. Second committee, technology commercialization charge. Look at how we're structured in our practices and tell us whether or not there are things that we could change that would actually promote increased commercialization of some of the intellectual property that comes off our campus. They looked at, as you would expect, anything in the Vice President for Research and Technology Commercialization Office. They had liberty to talk to anybody that dealt in any licensing, including professors, those that have been very successful, professors such as the professor that holds the patent for the lithium battery, to professors that were frustrated because they couldn't get anything done, seemingly. Look at all startup activities. We have a number of entities across campus, the venture labs, talk to venture capitalists, et cetera. And by the way, a number of the members of the committee were from the venture capital arena that were quite familiar with this space. Interesting study, fascinating study, well worth a read of the details of that. But the first thing they did is they went out and they went to about 15 different schools that were viewed, some as very successful, let's say the Stanfords of the world in technology commercialization, and some that were far less successful, to find out what's the secret sauce, what's the magic ingredient. And they came away believing and telling us that they think technology commercialization is a very serendipity event from a university perspective, meaning you should not be in the business of trying to pick the winners and decide who's going to win, who goes to market, and whether or not you're going to invest in that. Let the market decide that. What you need to do is you need to emphasize a volume. Get it through the pipe. Make it easy to do business, and let the people out there that this is their business take a look at more volume, because more volume will breed more dollars. Stanford, pointed out that, look, all it takes is one Google to make you look good, and they benefit from things like that. It covers up a lot of losses. But Stanford's model and many of the high-performing models are exactly this. Emphasize volume, make it easy to do business. Staff up the licensing team. We tell professors, look, we're going to break down barriers, we're going to make this easy for you, and all these pieces of paper come to 2 or 3 desks, and it's virtually impossible for somebody to get these pieces of paper off their desk. They're just not enough people to license. Adjust the internal split. The way it works on campus today is when an inventor goes to market and there's a revenue that precipitates, that split, 50% to the campus, 50% to the inventor. What they're talking about is change the split that's on campus. Change it to not go back to central administration and to just the dean's office. Change it to where it gets down to actually the people in the lab that are working with the inventor to invent this. And so we're working through that very thing right now. Up till now, it was up to the dean as to whether or not the dean wanted to do that. Match the university's strengths to needs. Figure out what you're really good at. We excel in things like petroleum engineering, petroleum-related patents. Some of the biotech, although that's emerging from us. So really focus on where you can make a huge difference, where the potential for that volume might come from, and put your dollars there. And then establish student priority as an involvement. They really believe, we really believe, getting students involved almost day one that they step foot on campus as undergrads is a very, very, very good thing. Yes, sir.
I noticed in the report that this was the one item of the three they didn't have any dollar figures on.
That's correct.
Why not?
I guess because they view it's intangible. What is the benefit? The benefit that's going to be realized down the road is somewhere down the road, and that is either you're going to breed somebody that, or have somebody come out of school that ultimately becomes your next inventor, your next entrepreneur. I can only assume that that's the case. But what they saw was that active involvement was critical for the academic process with the student itself. And let's make no bones about it. Graduate students and undergraduate students are a high-quality, low-cost source of labor. I mean, it is. The universities are run on, in large part, the backs of graduate students and now undergraduate students. And I say that positively, not negatively. But I think they saw a lot of potential in that. Third, administrative services transformation, and I'll put this in plain English. Well, it talks about the federated model. That's the way we describe it on campus. For those of you in corporate service, it's the contentious issue between centralized versus decentralized. And we've all, any of us, particularly with gray hair, have lived through the pendulum swing. And what they've recommended is something that is actually fairly new in higher education, but it's old in corporate America. Don't repeat common practices across campus or common repetitive practices. Consolidate those practices, because chances are it's going to take fewer people to accomplish that activity better than what you're spending a day. And I'll get into that in a little bit. I've got a slide on that I think puts it in perspective. They decided to look at of many areas of administrative practice on campus. They decided to focus on 4: finance and accounting, procure to pay, human resources, and information technology, particularly in the programming and desktop support areas. They didn't focus on these other areas. But as you will note in the report, one of the things that they said was the areas we're going to focus on only comprise 25% of the administrative spend at the university. There are a lot of dollars in these other areas. Why did they focus in these areas? That is where shared services has been accomplished the most, the deepest in corporate America. It's the most target-rich. There's a proven model for adapting that. Their idea was embrace this, get it under your belt, show some success, but don't forget about going to these other areas. Estimated savings are three activities that they didn't identify as separate savings to shared administrative services model, although I can tell you the savings really comes from that. Implement a shared administrative services model. Continue to drive our strategic spending and our strategic sourcing. It's something that has been long employed in corporate service. I learned a lot about that at Dell. Study other administrative services. Don't forget about the rest of it. And all combined, $150 to $200 million. Now, I'm going to kind of give you the rest of the story in a minute, but I want to pause on this slide because it's my belief that the savings are probably overestimated on the asset side. But I will tell you, my belief is, based on what we've gotten into, they are underestimated on this side. I think in aggregate, the potential of saving the $390 to $490 million is there. I think it's mixed a little differently, and I'll tell you why in just a second here. The president took the report and told the campus, okay, these are people from the outside, high-level study, move quick, devil's in the details. Let's study this now. Let's adapt it to campus. Why? Again, high level, what are the specifics? If I want to implement shared services, I've got to get down to the actual job. I've got to get down to the actual task. It's going to take some substantial investment to get there. The committee tried to net out the cost of what they thought it would take to realize some of these savings, but I can tell you in some areas, for example, shared services, they took as an assumption that the university had already taken the decision to replace its administrative systems. It's a very expensive undertaking, and I'll show you in a second. It's probably a $70 to $80 million undertaking. That was not netted out. But I'll also show you a financing plan where we think that we can get that done and then achieve the savings that they were talking about. Be very mindful that some of these activities will actually increase the cost of education, and we're very concerned about that. If I raise parking rates, that raises rates potentially on students. If I raise housing and food rates, that affects parents and students. And we're mindful, as you're mindful, of the total cost of education, not just what we're charging for tuition and fees. And so it may call for a strategy that says, well, yeah, I can raise parking rates, but maybe I need to set aside a portion here for scholarships for housing or scholarships for parking or those kinds of things. Let's see. And the final, campuses. As you know, I call our campus the Berkeley of the Southwest. It does not like to be dictated to. People like to be consulted. We have bright minds. And what I find is that when you bring people around a table, we may agree to disagree, but as long as you've asked them, what is your opinion, and you've allowed them to express it, then we can bond and agree to move forward, even if somebody didn't agree that was the best strategy. And I find that that's been very effective across campus. Most of these activities, particularly shared service, touch the entire campus. It will take a village, so to speak, to achieve what we want to achieve there. I cannot do it alone in the Chief Financial Officer's office. The administration can't just impose it. If we're going to be successful, we've got to get the campus involved. So President Powers named a champion of this report. I'm the champion. I tell people I've been called many things in my career, not a champion, but now I'm a champion. I've established internal committees to work through. The devil's in the details. I've tried to establish committees. They're all published on the web at the site that I show you that are cross-organizational, cross-functional. I put the committees on a fairly tight time frame to say, okay, by the end of the fall semester, by the end of the calendar year, we need to be prepared to give the President recommendations as to what are we going to do, when are we going to do it, and begin to drive towards it. Now, I will tell you on the shared services side, we're doing much more than that. And the reason I say that is because one of the things the President said, I've got a slide later in the deck, was as it relates to shared services. Well, we can talk about everything. We need to talk about what does that mean and how do we implement that. It is a no-brainer idea. We just need to get after it. So we're working on very detailed plans down to the job level as to what we will do. Now, we will vet that plan across campus in the fall as a straw man plan, refine it, and make our final recommendations about that. Now, I put this slide up here because I did want to go through several points if I have the time. Am I running late? And just give you some thoughts of what I'm seeing coming out of these committees, but nothing conclusive by any means. The committees are spending the summer doing their homework on these, building their financial models so that they can look at this. One of the things we didn't get from this high-level committee are the financial models that underpinned a lot of this. So we're going back and trying to redocument that and understand what they were talking about. When you get to things like the power plant, what I've learned is that power plant's very much using the analogy of like driving a car. I can drive a car to get to work from home, and I can drive it one of two ways. Either I can drive it with, easy on the gas, slow start and build up, and then same thing when I brake, and the car will be very fuel efficient. Or I can either have my foot all the way on the pedal or all the way off the pedal. And I'll get to the same spot, maybe a little quicker, but I'll also use more gas. Power plant's the same way, I'm learning. Our power plant optimal efficiency operating point is at about 67 to 70% of capacity. I can operate it at 100% capacity, but it's going to consume much more input for the output, and that's what we're looking at now to see whether or not that makes economic sense. What I found was that the committee just assumed that additional capacity could be generated at no increased input, and there is an additional cost. So I think there's still a benefit, but the benefit I don't think will be quite as much. When we get to parking, I'm very pleased that the parking committee, they took a look at it and said, you're absolutely right, we can increase rates, and we've got 13 different permits, and we can increase rates here relative to market, et cetera. But wait a second. Let's step back and think about the bigger issue. How do we want to move, and what options do we want to give employees, faculty, and staff in terms of coming to campus daily and leaving campus daily? Let's think about what we're doing when we encourage and how we're going to encourage or discourage people to bring a car. How does that integrate with public transportation plans that we have? City of Austin is launching a bicycle plan that's become very popular in cities like New York City. Don't know how that'll play. Let's think about this holistically so that where we do increase parking permits, let's say, let's do it strategically. I've got garages that are underutilized. I've got garages that are overutilized. Maybe one goes up, one goes down. but let's also give all of those folks an option. Gee, I don't want to pay the additional price, but I can ride the bus for free, or I can, I only live blocks away, I'll take a bike, et cetera. So they're going to approach this much more holistically, but there is headroom to price up on parking. Housing and food, again, is we have not launched that committee yet because at the time when this report was coming out, Housing and Food had already embarked on, they had engaged a consultant to take a look at the local market. West Campus is booming. Compare our facilities to those facilities, what we're charging, et cetera. And while the report is not complete, I can tell you the report's going to say we could price up and we could price up substantially. I think what this committee, when we constitute it, is going to have to come up with a strategy. How do we do that? I don't want to build on-campus housing for only wealthy kids that can afford it. We need diverse socioeconomic, ethnic communities. And so how are we going to accomplish that? So I think the kinds of people we'll have on this committee, I think we'll price up, but the kinds of people we'll have on the committee I think will be very different because these are the issues that they're going to need to look at. And how do we deal with this issue of affordability? But we'll see. Remains to be seen. Again, final reports will come out no later than the end of the year. That was President Power's comment about shared service. And as I said, shared service in the corporate arena is commonplace. We did it at Dell, et cetera. It's somewhat unique in the academic world, but it's catching on. Yale University, Indiana, Michigan, New York University. We've been to visit all of them. Some of them are Yale's very far along that curve and has been very successful. What we're trying to do is accelerate our ability to embrace that kind of model by learning from others, structuring around, I have no problem plagiarizing somebody's great idea. I'd rather do that. We don't need to cut our teeth and because we're Texas. These are administrative services. We ought to be able to take a look at this. Interestingly enough, what we're also finding, though, is getting back to the notion that we want to make this part of our DNA. Once we get to this point, we shouldn't stop there. We ought to look at other organizations outside that do the same thing. Our colleagues at A&M do the same thing. Our colleagues at IBM, at Motorola, at Dell do many of the same things. There might be partnerships and there might be abilities there to go to what is referred to as a managed service, outsource it to an even larger consortium to, again, bring that leverage of numbers in. Investments in some of the systems to support this are very significant. I put this slide in just because I think it helps to mention what is the difference between centralized versus distributed. What is a shared service model? And actually the Accenture guys had put this together, and I think it really crystallized it for me. One focuses, central model focuses, and I know when we were doing this back in the 80s in the corporate world, solely on cost. Decentralized, like the campus is today, is almost solely on service. Oh, I get so much better service because Mary's sitting right next to me and knows how I travel and how I submit. Shared services is somewhere in between. You got to balance off quality with cost, and you have to do it in an environment where, if you're customers, you have a say in what goes on. So what we're talking about is having a separate, almost entity on campus where we're all contributing people that do this kind of work. It'll have to report up to some spot on campus, but it has a shared governance board so that the customers on campus, the colleges, the vice presidents, et cetera, feel like they have some control, and in fact do have some control over the quality of service. I put this slide in because you can see the kind of time frames that we're talking about. When you put out numbers like this, one of the things that you realize very quickly is that a lot of questions are, why is it going to take so long? Shared services is a long journey. Others that have embarked on it will tell you that. But at the same time, if that project wasn't big enough, we have made the decision that we're going to replace our core administrative systems. It's the optimal time to do it. Map out what it is you want to do. Bring in new systems that will actually enable what you want to do. Either one of those projects is huge, but it's the optimal time to do it, so we've decided to do it. I included this because we're looking at two different alternatives and strategies. The dark blue line is SaaS is software as a service. It's cloud-based solutions. What we're finding is the new wave in ERPs. The old wave was PeopleSoft. You buy it, you buy your machines, you run it, and then every quarter you're on a continual, here's a new patch or here's a new upgrade, do it. It's a very expensive proposition. All that has been moved now to cloud-based solutions. PeopleSoft is beginning to move into what they call their Fusion product. But the guys that wrote PeopleSoft, actually the original lead, a guy named Dave Duffield, when he sold PeopleSoft to Oracle, he had a 3-year not to compete, and Dave didn't let the dust settle underneath his feet. He began writing his software as a solution, a service solution. He came out with a product that is absolutely storming the market, Workday. In fact, if you look at the last 10 major procurements in higher education space of ERPs, Workday's won 9 out of 10. We're now in the midst of an RFP process, and no doubt those two will go head on. The curves are about the same, but you see the dip, and at the low point of the dip of either curve, the other one, by the way, is hosted. It would be a hosted solution. We're talking $60 to $70 million investment in systems. That's what's causing that dip, and also in the cost to implement shared service and go through all the work. But you can see how we climb out, and if you get to the tail end, what you see is whether you're talking about software as a service or a hosted solution, right now our belief is that delta, that benefit, that recurring savings is probably more in the range of 25 to 30 million, maybe as much as 35. So remember, their estimate was 150 to 200. I would say the estimate would be 250 to 350 at this point. Again, devil's in the details, but I'm very optimistic out of what I see. By the way, we're using that savings to pay for the bet that we want to take on implementing systems. I've gone to the university and said, here's what it's going to cost us to put in administrative systems. I don't want the money. I just need a loan. And I need you to understand, my backing is our ability to achieve this shared service. We got a lot riding on this shared service. My ability to repay that loan, and the president's taken that bet, and I think it's a great bet. With that said, I very much appreciate the time, and I'm happy to take questions. And I apologize for taking more than my share of time.
Great presentation, and we had allotted a pretty significant amount of time for this reason. So. Appreciate it. Members, questions? Ray?
I have, as the sole engineer on the group who likes numbers, I have a few questions.
Yes, sir.
In my experience, every time one estimates what it's going to cost to implement a new system, at the end of the day, it actually costs double.
Yes.
Have you considered a contingency like that in what you're estimating here in your last curve?
Absolutely. And remember, that curve is, we believe we'll start to get some benefits out of shared services, principally in the information technology area, very quickly. And so that is a net number that you're looking at. Generally, to implement these kinds of systems, well, let me step back for just a second. I began my career, well, I didn't begin my career. I spent time with Trammell Crow, spent 6 years, and was responsible, the executive responsible for putting in systems there. I won't even say the name because it'll date me. Then at Associates, if that, those are efforts that you only want to do once in your career. Well, the word got out when I was at the Associates. They said, we're going to PeopleSoft and you're the guy. And then I will never forget the day that it was 3 months into my work at Dell. When I interviewed at Dell, I'd asked the question of Tom Meredith, and some of you may know Tom Meredith. He was my boss. He was the CFO of Dell at the time. And I said, Tom, how are your financial systems? Oh, they're great. They're great. Okay, so you don't have any intention to replace them? No. And I took the job. 3 months into it, I get an email from Tom. He was 2 cubes over. The email said, I lied, come see me. I got tapped to put in Oracle financials. And I have teammates on my team. For example, our CIO spent a 25-year career at Accenture doing this. Some pretty good experience on estimating. But with that said, every organization is different. We have a contingency planned in. The reality of it is putting a system in is probably more like a $100 million price tag with the contingency itself, but there's some offsets there.
I want to go also to the parking.
Yes.
To me, I've never understood why universities don't closer price parking to, one, the marketplace, and maybe not as high for the reasons you stated, and two, distribute the parking. You're right. You go to a campus and this garage is overflowing and this garage is half empty. But more importantly, why we don't increase the parking rate on an annual basis? It's not unlike toll roads. It's a very political process. I understand that. You'll see toll roads, they won't increase, they won't increase, they won't increase, and boom, they got a 15% increase. And then there's a huge outcry. Why not a 3% a year? We all pay it by by tags nowadays. It's not like you had to dig out the pennies to pay the toll on your way out. Why not just incrementally increase it as we go along?
A great observation, and what I've told the committee was, I'm like anybody else. I don't like my bills to go up, but I like it even less when it surprises me. Let's make it predictable. One of the things that has to come out of this group is a rational pricing strategy. Because one of the things the committee looked at was the last 10 years of pricing, and if you graphed it, it would look like this. You go through periods of time when there's nothing, as you said, and all of a sudden you have a huge jump. So that's part of the answer. We absolutely need a rational pricing strategy. The other part is actually bifurcated. One is the issue of cost of an education to a student, but I've got 20,000 employees that come to work, and I need to consider what the impact is on them, because our target market and where we stir into is at about 20–25% off the high point market. If I have somebody that comes to work for the university, they could go to work at Dell and do the same thing and earn about 20–25% more. It depends on the job. If I'm going to discount to market, I probably need to be discounted to market also as it relates to what I'm going to charge them. But I begin to be less sensitive to that to the extent I give them an array of options, and that's why I'm excited about the campus looking at this more holistically. You can choose to pay at market for the best permit you can possibly buy, or here's some things that you can cut your cost on, but it's your choice now, not the campus coming to you saying you've got one and only choice, and by the way, it's going up dramatically. But so those are some of the things, but pricing strategy absolutely is something that has to come out of this.
One more question, and
Yes,
I'll
sir.
shut up. I don't know what the annual budget is, and you're saving, what was the number? $30 to $40 million a year over that 10-year period.
Yes.
And I don't know what the total budget is, but this is only focused on the administration of the campus.
That's correct. Only a fraction of the administration.
And we do the same thing in business. You assign somebody to do a study on how you can become more efficient or more profitable, and the first target is the administration.
Yes.
What about the processes in which we work? What about the process? Are you going to look at other processes, for example, the way we teach?
Absolutely. In fact, there is a whole separate body of activity going on in terms of course transformation, looking at how we use technology, how we integrate distance learning with classroom learning, all those kinds of things. A totally separate effort with literally millions of dollars being invested in that. And so that's happening on the academic side. Absolutely. And I would expect on the administrative side, remember, we're trying to change the DNA, and the committee has said, and I agree, don't lose sight of the other 75%. There is more there. Thank you very much for the questions.
But it's also commendable that the committee said, let's focus in on the low-hanging fruit. And some of that low-hanging fruit is probably influenced by how politically easy it is to grab, as well as the ease of the opportunity. I assume, are you also doing root cause analysis on why the parking demand varies?
Absolutely, absolutely. The committee is going through all of that, and I purposefully have an engineer on the committee because being a finance and accounting person, I'm more numbers or data driven. So I've put a person on the committee that's an engineer, and I've also put a person that heads up our data warehousing activities, so people can't say, well, we can't get that data. They'll have all the access to that so that we can go through and do root cause analysis, do real financial modeling, so that we come out with something and sell something to the campus. It's based on as much fact as we know. Obviously, there's going to be some subjectivity.
Yeah. Well, because obviously the committee, everything from location to lighting and 100 other reasons.
Absolutely.
Lee?
Here we go. 3 questions. And this is a great study, Kevin.
Thank you.
I really admire it. One of the things it illustrates is that shared services is not just a statewide, system-wide issue. It's a campus issue.
Absolutely.
And there will be some services that will work depending on the geography of your system on a shared basis, and others, depending on the geography and the traditions, will be campus. I was interviewing an IT leader at one of our major private universities 3 years ago, and we're in the midst of a major shared service initiative. I asked him if you're probably not familiar with this. You're at a large private university. He said, we have deans so powerful that they have their own email server programs, and we have not been able to get up enough oomph to force them to share a single email program at our private university. Now, that's an illustration of how granular the variation is even on a single university campus, and there are built-in costs for that kind of variation that nobody's quantifying. Nobody comes into the president and says, do you know you're spending an additional $73,000 a year on both the licensing and the manpower to operate 3 different email programs on this campus? So we've made a major effort in our case because our system is consolidated in one metropolitan area, 3 campuses 35 miles apart. We've moved 350 employees together in a shared service staff, but our campuses are also doing their own studies. Question I wanted to ask you, because I think it ties into the work of this council and the coordinating board, is it possible to envision something of a balanced scorecard for shared service? Because a lot of the measurement is, with all due respect, measurement by press release. We're going to save $18 billion over the next 20 years. Nobody's really auditing that and doing much of a measurement. And I think to actually measure the dollars, by the way, it gets really hard because you have to make assumptions about whether rates of increase would have considered, would we be paying the same amount? But you can certainly measure whether you have 3 senior purchasing directors on your campus, or in my case, in my system. You know, do we have 3 independent procurement offices headed by the management necessary, yes or no? Or do we have 1? You could create a scorecard for sharing, and I know this will sound odd, but I think that would be a useful thing for the coordinating board to do. You know, who buys all of their laptop computers together in one contract? Who has multiple zillions of contracts? You could have a list of things so that shared service then becomes a path, and you can measure how far along you are. There may be a good reason why you want to allow your 2 biggest colleges to have their own email services, but that scorecard is something that you know we're still working through. We have 350 employees. We now only have 1 purchasing director. We only have 1 payroll director. We're going to refine the processes, but we're finding within each of those areas multiple situations. Even though we share a PeopleSoft-based single EIS system, campuses have chosen to do administrative procedures differently, and we didn't override those on day one. Obviously, we put all the employees together in a pool. Now their work process is to go find these variations, put them on the table, cost them out, debate them, see how long the license lasts. So we're on a journey that you can measure and you can score. And I think there are other areas of measurement in student service. How long does it take you to turn around a financial aid request to give a student an answer? How many person hours are used evaluating each financial aid application? Those kind of measures could be structured, and we could be reporting them. And then I would have a benchmark so that my person who thinks we have the best financial aid process in the world, because they only hear positive, they hear a lot of thanks. No complaints. Is that a good one? Well, what if it takes 3 times as long and 5 times as many FTE staff as our peers in the state? It's not so good just because everybody's happy.
That's right. That's right. Well, most systems these days, as you well know, you have electronic documents, and they're usually paired with workflow. That means you can capture exactly the kind of statistics that you're talking about. I love it when a customer comes to me where we have actually done that sort of thing, for example, in the procurement area, and says it's taken way too long. Oh, well, let's look at this. And then they're just shocked when I pull up data that says, oh, okay, it went from your desk to this desk. That took 14 days. It went from my desk, from your desk to my desk to the vendor. That took 2 days. So let's focus on the problem. We have to capture that. 2 things I would say relative to your comments, because I think they're right on target. One, I recently got back, spent a few days at Harvard. They had there's a worldwide, or not worldwide, it's National Council on Shared Services. This is becoming an emerging, not just industry, but career. And so you had public and private institutions from all over the nation there. And one presentation that particularly resonated with me was an engineering professor from Harvard. And I had the fortune of sitting next to him at lunch, and we got to talking. And I said, well, what's Harvard doing in the area of shared services? services. And he said almost exactly the same thing. Oh, at Harvard, these deans are so powerful, we will be the last to implement shared services. One of the things, though, that I took away from that is I am absolutely committed to capturing the savings that we put out there, because I, like you, get frustrated by the media events that are created versus the reality. I've taken out, I view it, a $100 million loan or $70 million net, and I got to repay that. How am I going to do that? In visiting with some colleagues at Ohio State who have been on the shared services model implementing for some period of time, one of the things that they did that I thought was magnificent is they have a person they hired whose sole job is accountability. Let's make sure we capture the savings. We understand where it comes from. We understand where it went to, if it goes someplace. But let's have somebody on point for that, because if it's everybody's part-time job, everybody's fully employed, it'll never get done. We have to have somebody on point. I have to have somebody on point because I've got to repay that loan. And at the end of the day, somebody should be asking me, we've got a free cash flow. The idea was to move it from the back office to education and research. What happened? Where's that money? And so I think your comments are absolutely on point. The final thing I would say is there's no reason why, as we all progress to a shared services model, why we shouldn't be collaborating and saying, your people already do this. Let's figure out how we leverage that. It becomes much, much easier as the world moves to a cloud solution, where there's one instance, we're all in that instance. Anytime there's an upgrade, you're not doing it separately from me. It's in the one solution. So it'll become much easier, I think, as we move forward, and we ought to be asking that question.
Jody, then Phil.
Yes, sir. First of all, Kevin, excellent report. I might not understand shared services that well, but my question to you is related to the stakeholders and their participation in the process. Your committee is pulling together the report for the president, for an example. But at the end of the day, on parking, on facilities, on whatever you're doing in these technology, you're impacting somebody, i.e. the student, the faculty, or other end users in the system. What input will they have prior to finalizing recommendations? Because I think that's critical. At the end of the day, if you're going to have controversy, you address it in the beginning. And in this academic arena, that is the time to get a consensus from the end users. So how do they come into play, Kevin, in this whole process of cost effectiveness, cost reduction, cost increases, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, thank you for the question. Absolutely. The reason I described the summer as, and I've described it this way to the committees, do homework. Mm-hmm. Do basic modeling, do homework. Do not come to conclusions, because when the fall comes and the campus comes alive again, we've got all faculty, all students, all staff back, you need to figure out a process to vet your ideas and what you're thinking through campus. And that might be done through blogs, through probably not websites, although we need to publish it on websites, but town halls. We do a lot of town halls, those kinds of things, Jody, because our campus will not embrace something that hasn't been. I mean, you and I were students there. We know. It's we don't like to be dictated to. But again, what I find is, and I find this with the professorial community, that, you know, some people would say, oh, they're tough, they're tough. You go out and you show an interest. Just what do you think? What are your ideas? You engage them. Then even though we might not agree, it was, you know, the best idea in their opinion, they will embrace it. And I think we've got that in spades. We've got smaller examples of that. These are major endeavors, again, particularly shared services, and we will not get them done the way we want them done without that kind of campus engagement. Same thing, though, as it relates to raising any pricing to anybody. Everybody has to have a voice, and I've challenged the committees to come up with those opportunities to give the campus a voice before they then finalize their recommendations and make a recommendation to campus. Because that's the first thing President Powers is going to ask.
Yeah.
Has this been vetted with the campus?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just so I don't forget, there's a couple of tools that you may want to consider and probably already have. One is, of course, the use of Kaizen events, because it engages the faculty, the operations people in developing the plan, the ideas, how you're going to deploy that particular piece of continuous improvement. The second one is one we have invested in here at the coordinating board, but haven't fully deployed it yet, but plan to do so rapidly, and that's a software solution that allows us to conduct virtual town halls, online, not anonymous, but identified participation by folks. And we hope to use that very soon in the rulemaking process. Lee, you'll appreciate that.
It's very important because what I learned very quickly was students don't keep the same schedule I keep. They're more nocturnal.
Yeah. So we'd be happy to share with you. Dom Chavez, I think, is our expert. I'm sure he's just jumping for joy I'm mentioning his name in this regard. But we'd happy to share with you what we've invested in and how it works in case it's a tool that y'all could use.
Thank
Phil?
you.
Well, Kevin, congratulations on a great effort here. I think it was a wonderful presentation, and it's going to be a wonderful initiative for the campus. Couple of things. One, the mouse in the punch bowl is still faculty productivity because of the huge dollars there. And I know you mentioned that there's an effort going on. I've seen these efforts so often, and and generally what happens is you end up with a new delivery system for getting to the students and whatever. But when it comes to the bottom line of, say, a faculty-student ratios, things don't change very much. They just don't end up changing. So you really don't initiate a lot of savings. I truly hope that something different is afoot at the University of Texas, but not only at the University of Texas at Austin, but statewide. The second, and it's just a comment, two of the institutions, the last two institutions you just mentioned, Ohio State and Harvard, have embraced RCM, responsibility-centered management. Ohio State's been in it a while, and Harvard is starting to embrace it because of the very issue you just raised. They can't get deans to do these things. But until they get deans to start recognizing revenue along with their expenses, maybe they will get them to start embracing shared services and those types of things. Have you even looked at RCM?
RCM is as you know, very controversial in higher education. There have been those institutions that have adopted RCM and spent a lot of time to put an RCM model in place, and now are unwinding it.
I know one, Michigan.
Iowa State's the same way. There are actually
are they unwinding it?
Absolutely, there are several out there. I think that the challenge with RCM is, and I'll go back. I'm not picking on engineering, but I remember that when I first came to campus, the then current engineering dean pulled me aside and said, "Kevin, I'll tell you the answer to all your financial woes. Let in fewer liberal arts students and more engineers." And they were looking at the state multiplier of what the state paid for an engineer versus what the. And I said, well, you need to look at the bottom line. What's the margin? And I don't know what the margin is. And that was where RCM could, I think, really be helpful. Because my belief is it's actually a net negative margin in training an engineer when you really load it up for tuition and everything, given the huge investment that you make in infrastructure versus, let's say, a social workers. So I think that there's some very good points as to information we might have and how we might act differently in some ways. What RCM does not, and I don't think cannot measure, is the esoteric value associated with the question of why do we need social workers? Why do we train social workers or musicians or et cetera, et cetera? Because there is we would say it's very critical to the learning environment to be able to provide courses in those areas, to actually train people in those areas. But the campus, the average student is taking courses across disciplines. How do you value that? So under an RCM model, do I now tell an engineer, well, you've got to take some fine arts, but that course is going to be very, very, very expensive to you, or it's going to be so you have a transfer pricing issue, and there are no easy answers. So I guess I'm on the sideline still asking the question, what would we make better decisions, and how would we make them with that? It's actually interesting. I've asked that very same question. You may know we're interviewing for a provost, and we have 3 outside, 1 inside candidates, and I've asked that very same question to all 4, 2 of which are in RCM models, and gotten very, very different answers. But most of them have come back and said, the challenge is this: how do I value these other disciplines that I feel we need to teach?
And,
but anyway.
and I think there is I think there is a model for RCM addressing that. And before we start saying, I think far more institutions are starting to embrace it than are unwinding it. And the only two that I know unwinding it now, this Ohio State, which is also like UT, the flagship institution, which might have certain things available to them that maybe these others don't. But Harvard is starting to embrace it. Rutgers is starting, and that's a $3 billion operation. They're interviewing for your job, basically, for somebody who can do that. So, and there are subvention funds that are set aside to address the very issue you just talked about. So. That's the reason I raised it, because when a dean starts looking at their revenue along with their expenses, they have to say, okay, I have to start making very good arguments and very good decisions.
Absolutely.
But that's just
just the very fact, Phil, that I have to guess at a margin tells you that there's a need for something. We ought to be able to say, here's what we fund, and here's what we get paid for teaching an engineering semester credit hour. Here's what it costs, and make a conscious decision to make the investment if that's in fact what it is. We ought to know that, to your point, and I absolutely agree.
Good luck on your.
We've got time for one more question. And I sense that Elaine and Lee have somehow negotiated over this 30-foot gap.
I was going to pile on this and just say, I see a way in which RCM and shared services go together. At Michigan, it wasn't that it was robbing from engineering to support the education college. It was that a very centralized environment had been decentralized too much, and all the deans had too much power because they got to keep their tuition and their earned revenue, and they decided it was fragmenting the university. Well, what's missing is this responsibility for paying for improvements and who gets to share the revenue. So if you've got a new parking plan and a governance committee in shared service is sitting there with all the deans or their representative around the table, and you say, hey, we're going to save $10 million, but who gets it? Who gets the benefit of it? Let's divide up that pie. Or if you have a way to manage your conference rooms to pack everybody in a smaller number of conference rooms, turn down the electricity on your power management. Again, the deans would be sitting at the table in a shared service environment saying, well, okay, we're willing to support this change if we know where the revenue stream's going to go. I just think it would help the governance of shared service to have that kind of clarity, not just about the margin, but about where these savings would flow.
Great observation. Kevin, obviously one of the best presentations we've seen. You've generated a lot of interest and a lot of ideas. The one thing I'm curious about is what was the budget for this committee effort?
The committee members donated their time, and actually we had agreed to pay their travel expenses, but they donated those too. We did spend almost $1 million on Accenture time. Now, I would tell you that's on about a $4 million bill. We paid $1 million because Steve Rollator and the firm donated all of the senior time. But it was not without a substantial amount of expense to get there. Yeah.
But the point is you invested in the outside resources to accelerate
absolutely. Absolutely. Well, it goes back to, again, President Power's belief that if it's everybody's part-time job, nothing gets done. We need to be willing to make an investment, a measured investment, and expect a return. And believe me, he reminds me every day, expects a return.
I've experienced both the plus and the minus side of that in my own organization, so I appreciate what you're saying. Thanks for your time. I have a feeling that everybody's going to want your phone number.
I'm happy to. As I said, we learn ourselves every time we share. In fact, in many cases, we bring more back than we give, and we're happy to do that. And I will leave this over here if anybody else is interested in some of the other things that we've done over the last decade. But thank you very much.
We look forward to watching it evolve. Thank you.
Thank you.
We will move next to, I guess we now move to the Closing the Gaps room now or after the next panel? That means what? Now. Now, okay. So that is upstairs on the, yeah, take your packets with you, particularly if that's what you're using to write. Right.
Good thing you don't have to worry about a quorum.
It occurred to me that if we needed to blame anything on lack of a quorum, we could do that. The Council for Continuous Improvement and Innovation will reconvene to hear a very brief summary of the smallest of group discussions. With our attrition, we consolidated into a single group, and Melinda will describe the findings or the questions as it really turns out. Melinda?
Well, the council members decided before they could accurately and be readily informed to answer the 3 questions charged with them today, felt that first they needed to examine what the future and/or transition of the council itself was, namely addressing the focus and the charge of the council in addressing quote-unquote leaks in institutions. That's just one example of something they think they need to re-examine. To what extent, and then also the role of the 2036 Commission. So they gave themselves a homework assignment to look at the questions charged with them today, not just to try and rush and do all of that today, but to look at that and speak among themselves and have me help them facilitate and merge and look for themes and work on that in the next couple of months.
So we're going to gather the information to answer those questions and develop a recommendation on the evolution of this council, and then ask everyone to, as a homework assignment, so to speak, get Melinda your comments on the timeline. Any members who have something to add to that summary, or any lingering questions that we didn't already address in our small group discussion? Not, the chair will entertain a motion for adjournment. Okay. We've got a motion and a second from Roberto and Charles. I think it's yours because I had a copy also.
It's from our A&M press. I got you too.